Okay, y'all, we're going to go ahead and begin. It's Martha. I hope you all are having a great Thursday afternoon. Beautiful sunny day out there. We're going to go ahead and mute all your lines right now.
The leader has muted your line. To unmute your line, press *6 or #6.
And if you feel the need that you need to urgently ask a question, go ahead and push #6, which will unmute your line. And so we're going to go ahead and begin. Again, thank you for all being here. A few little housekeeping items before we start. Again, as I just mentioned, *6 unmutes your line. I'm sorry, #6 unmutes your line. *6 mutes your line again. So keep that in mind. Also, please don't put this call or this webinar on hold if you have to leave for whatever reason.
To unmute your line, press *6 or #6.
So if something happens and you need to leave the webinar, please go ahead and hang up, and then you can always dial back in and get back on into the webinar. These webinars are now being recorded, and they're available on Inside AZ Moves. If you go to Agent Tools, then go to Education. Actually, it's Education and Tutorials. Then once you click on that, you go to Recorded Webinars. You click on that, and then there's the Ask the Broker webinar. So again, Inside AZ Moves, under Agent Tools, under Education and Tutorials, under Recorded Webinars, and then finally Ask the Broker. So hopefully we didn't hide it too much under 1, 2, 3, 4, about 5 clicks. So anyway, we are going to begin. Today's session is going to be a little bit different. Oh, if you need to ask any questions and you don't want to unmute, you can go ahead. You'll see at the bottom of the screen, you can chat, and actually that sends me an email, essentially, or a chat. No one else sees it, just me. So if you have a question and you want to communicate with me during the presentation that way, that is fine. Please feel free to do so. So we're actually going to do 3 different forms today because none of the 3 forms would take a full hour. So I just wanted to kind of go over some of the basics of the forms. So the first one is disclosure of lead-based paint. And actually, it was requested by one of our OAs, which I appreciate very much. It was Stacy Bell over in the Mesa office. Hopefully she's listening, that we would go over this on a webinar because, and this is a historical problem that we've had for, I can't tell, probably since the lead-based paint form came out, which has been many, many, many moons ago. In fact, according to this particular form, I'm looking to see what the, doesn't have a date on it. The AER puts the dates on, but it's been around for a long time, as we all know. Because this is all based on federal law. Actually, this one says January 2009, but that was just an update. I bet you it's been around since the 90s at least. Obviously, any property that has been built prior to 1978 must have a lead-based paint disclosure. And again, this is by federal law. This is not Arizona law. This is not coal banker law. This is federal law. So this pertains to any home or residential dwelling built prior to 1978 anywhere in the United States. So if you purchase a property in some other state and you buy a property that is older than 1978, you better make sure that your agent over there also has you fill out a lead-based paint disclosure. The verbiage is also by federal law. Obviously, AAR took the verbiage and worked it into one of their forms, but the verbiage itself is per federal law. Back to the purchase contract, it's actually 4C of the purchase contract. It does say if the premises was built prior to 1978, the seller shall, number 1, notify the buyer of any known lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazards in the premises, which is what the disclosure form does. 2, provide the buyer with a lead-based paint risk assessments or inspection of the premises in the seller's possession, which again the disclosure form does. Number 3, provide the buyer with the disclosure of information on lead-based paint and lead-based paint hazards, which is that pamphlet that all of your offices have, and again, this is required by federal law. So every time you sell a house that is older than 1978, not only does the seller and the buyer have to complete the disclosure on lead-based paint form, but they also must get the pamphlet that, again, is entitled Disclosure of Information on Lead-Based Paint and Lead-Based Paint Hazards. Required. All your offices have them. We get them from the association. We supply the offices. If your OAs say you're out of them, please let Stephanie in my office know, and she will order your office more. Doesn't hurt to keep a few of them, in your desk drawer. Don't take a whole bunch of them because you may not be selling that many older homes. But as a reminder that every time you use the disclosure of lead-based paint form, the pamphlet is required. So that's number 3 in the purchase contract. Actually, the name of the pamphlet, I'm mistaken as I read this. The pamphlet is actually called Protect Your Family from Lead-Based Paint. So again, that's the name of the pamphlet. Protect your family from lead in your home. Again, protect your family from lead in your home. Now I got it right. Then it also says, buyer shall return a copy of the disclosure of information on lead-based paint and lead-based paint hazards to the seller prior to close of escrow. Then it goes on in the purchase contract to say lead-based paint information was provided prior to contract acceptance, and buyer acknowledges the opportunity to conduct a lead-based paint or LBP risk assessment or inspections during the inspection period. Normally that doesn't happen. Normally the lead-based paint information is not given to the buyer prior to contract acceptance. And again, this is kind of based on federal law. Then on line 150, it says seller shall provide the lead-based paint information within 5 days after contract acceptance. So the seller is going to give this disclosure form to the buyer within 5 days after contract acceptance. Then it says buyer may, within 10 days or blank days after receipt of the lead-based paint information, conduct or obtain a risk assessment or inspection of the premises for the presence of lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazards, which is considered the, quote, assessment period. Buyer then may, within 5 days after receipt of the lead-based paint information or 5 days after expiration of the assessment period, cancel this contract. So this is another out. I don't think I've ever seen a buyer cancel regarding this, but essentially what it means is if the property was built prior to 1978 and if the buyer decides to do their own lead-based paint inspection, the buyer essentially has 5 days to do that after contract acceptance. I'm sorry, it's 10 days after contract acceptance to have those assessments done. And then once they receive the information, they have 5 days after that to cancel the contract. So it's not kind of an open-ended cancellation. It is only based on the buyer has to be proactive and have some type of inspection or, again, some type of assessment of the lead-based paint on the property. So just because it's built prior to 1978 doesn't give them an opportunity to cancel after they receive the disclosure of lead-based paint. So hopefully everybody understands that. So that's what the purchase contract says. So now we're back to the form itself. So we've got the lead warning statement, which essentially says every buyer of an interest in residential real property in which a residential dwelling was built prior to 1978 is notified that such property may present exposure to lead from lead-based paint, which may place young children at risk of developing lead poisoning. Lead poisoning in young children may produce permanent neurological damage, including learning disabilities, reduced intelligence, quotient behavioral problems, and impaired memory. Lead poisoning also poses a particular risk to pregnant women. The seller of any interest in residential real property is required to provide the buyer with any information on lead-based paint hazards from risk assessments or inspections in the seller's possession. Again, that's referenced back in the purchase contract. also in that 4C section. Then it goes on to say, or in the seller's possession, and to notify the buyer of any known lead-based paint hazards. A risk assessment or inspection for possible lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazards is recommended prior to purchase. So if the buyer decides to do a risk assessment or inspection for possible lead-based paint, there is that time frame built into the purchase contract. So then we go to seller's disclosure or seller's disclosure section. And it says seller must complete and initial sections A, B, and C below. The issue we're having, and I start out by saying historically we've been having issues with buyer's agents having the buyer sign a blank disclosure on lead-based paint form, sends it, let's say, with the offer, with the idea that the seller then would complete it and get a copy back to the buyer after they execute the purchase contract. No, 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 no. The buyer should never, never, never sign a blank lead-based paint disclosure form. What the buyer is doing, and as you all know or should know, that all the agents have to sign this form as well. They are acknowledging, the buyer is acknowledging how the seller has completed the form, and we'll see that towards the signature lines. But they are acknowledging how the seller and what the seller has said on the form, so they can never, ever sign a blank lead-based paint disclosure form. Okay, so again, the only time the buyer signs the form is when it's already been completed by the seller. I know we don't see REO properties as much anymore, and there was questions when we first started seeing, many, many, many REO properties, that the REO companies were just refusing to fill out our lead-based paint disclosure form, among other, AAR forms. The real estate industry, and I'm sure this is state or nationwide again, had to educate these lenders that, hey guys, this is by federal law. This is not a state law, like I had mentioned before. It's not a company policy. This is by federal law. If a property is being sold, whether it's an REO property or a short sale or whatever the case is, this form or this information must be given to the buyer. So again, the information on the form is by federal law. The form is obviously just an AAR form. So finally, after I don't know how many years of wrangling with the REOs, what they pretty much ended up doing is adding the mandated language into their own addenda. I'm sure you probably saw that if you ever dealt with REOs, that they would not sign our form, but that exact same language was put into their addendum, whether or not they had it, obviously they had no knowledge of any lead-based paint because they don't have knowledge of anything on an REO property or foreclosed property. But again, they're smart enough to take that language and put it in their addenda, their different addenda. So we have, again, back to seller's disclosure section, lead-based paint and or lead-based paint hazards, check either one or two below. Either seller is aware or seller has no knowledge. And so they check whatever the case is and they initial. Then on B, records and reports available to the seller. Either the seller has provided the buyer with available records or there are no records. Okay, and again, they mark one of the boxes and they initial. Okay, they have to mark either box on line 10 or box 12 or box 16 or box 18. So and they're always going to initial. So in the first section, one of those boxes, either one or two, are going to be marked. In the second section, or B section, either one's going to be marked or two is going to be marked. The OAs are supposed to be looking to make sure that only one of those boxes and the initials required are there. So the seller's obviously required to initial after they have marked the appropriate box in both section A and both section B. So now we have section C. Seller acknowledges seller's obligation to disclose to any real estate agent or agents to whom the seller directly or indirectly is to pay compensation with regard to the transaction contemplated by this disclosure, any known lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazards in the premises to be sold. So not only does the seller have the obligation to tell the buyer, but the seller also has the obligation to tell both agents, either the listing agent and the buyer's agent, hence the reason why they signed the form as well. And it goes on to say, as well as the existence of any reports or records related to lead-based paint or lead-based paint hazards in the premises to be sold. Seller further acknowledges that this disclosure accurately reflects the entirety of the information provided by the seller to the agents with regard to lead-based paint hazards, lead-based paint risk assessments, or inspection reports and records. So essentially that's the form, okay? So again, the seller's obligation is to let the buyer, listing agent, buyer's agent know if they are aware of any lead-based paint on the property. If they're not aware of it, one or the other, and they've given copies of any reports or assessments that they have or inspections, or they don't have any reports or assessments or inspections. Those are the options. Seller is required to initial whatever their option is. There's always going to be a box in Section 1A marked, as I just mentioned, and there's always going to be a box, in Section B marked as well. Okay, and then seller's initials required at the bottom of Section C also. So then buyer's acknowledgement, buyer must complete and initial Sections A, B, and C below. So buyer has read the information set forth and received copies of the reports, records, or other materials. If they have, they sign. Buyer has received the pamphlet. Here it is. Buyer has received the pamphlet. Protect your family from lead in your home. Okay? They initial, but they initial only if they've received the pamphlet, which you, as the buyer's agent, have a duty to give them. Again, those pamphlets are in your offices. C, buyer has, check 1, received a 10-day opportunity or mutually agreed upon period to conduct a risk assessment or inspection for the presence of lead-based paint and or lead-based paint hazards, or waived the opportunity to conduct a risk assessment or inspection for the presence of lead-based paint and or lead-based paint hazards. They either want the 10 days or they're waiving the 10 days. Buyer initials. One of those has to be, only one, either line 32 or line 34 must be marked. Now we have the agent's acknowledgement. And then it says, any real estate agent who has received compensation from the seller or the listing agent with regard to the transaction contemplated in this disclosure must initial below. So you've got the listing agent and the buyer's agent, referred to in this form as the cooperative agent or cooperating agent. So they initial as well. Line 37, 38, the agents who initial below has or have ensured the seller's compliance under the Residential Resale Lead-Based Paint Hazard Reduction Act of 1992, there's the federal law, by the seller's use and completion of this disclosure form. So essentially it's saying you as the listing agent have made sure that the seller has complied correctly to the best of their knowledge and the best of your knowledge, and you as the buyer's agent that the buyer has complied as well, and that made sure that the seller, I'm sure really not the buyer, but the seller has complied as well. And again, you as the buyer's agent, line 29, have given your buyer a pamphlet, Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home. You can also, by the way, you can also download the form online, but it doesn't look nearly as professional as the pamphlet itself. When you download it, I forget how many pages it is, but it's like 8 pages. And when you download it, you can fold it and staple it. But again, it doesn't look professional as the actual the printed pamphlets that we get from the associations. So keep that in mind. Then you have the certificate of accuracy, and by signing below, each signatory, everybody. This is seller, buyer, seller's agent, listing agent, buyer's agent, cooperating agent, acknowledges that he or she has reviewed the above information and certifies that, to the best of his or her knowledge, the information provided by the signatory is true and accurate. The fine, and again, this is federal law, this is HUD, EPA, it's my understanding that the fine for the non-disclosure of lead-based paint in a home when there's knowledge is over $10,000. In fact, I've heard as high as $50,000. That could be the seller, that could be the listing agent, each being fined 5 figures for not disclosing information that they have regarding lead-based paint in that house. So that's why it's really, really, really imperative that you do your job when it comes to using this form. So that's about it. Like I said, we're going to do 3 forms real quickly, and then we are going to ask or open it up to some questions. The next form is the AAR Buyer Contingency Addendum, and this is the form that would be used if a buyer is presenting an offer to the seller where that offer or that contract is contingent upon the buyer's current house selling. Now, I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail on this form because this form is currently under major revision by AAR. Thank you to Leah Lichter-Rodig, our manager of our Chandler office. She came to me with a situation back in December where we represented the seller. The buyer wrote an offer, which was accepted by the seller, contingent upon the buyer's house selling. The buyer's house, current property, was already under contract. So our seller said, okay, cool, then I'll go ahead and accept their contract because the buyer is in the process of, they've already started the ball rolling, they're already in escrow on their house, no big deal. About 3 weeks into our contract with that buyer, and about another 3 weeks before the close of escrow, the buyer's agent notifies our listing agent that the buyer's contract on the buyer's home fell through. Their buyer canceled. So now what? Well, according to how the form is now, unfortunately, the seller has no recourse. According to the form, there's nothing the seller can do until the close of escrow of this particular contract, which won't happen because the contract was contingent upon the buyer's other house selling. So they have to wait those 3 weeks or 3 months or whatever the case may be. Close of escrow never happens, and then buyer can cancel. I'm just going to go straight to that, the unfulfilled loan contingency at the very end there. If the sale and closing of buyer's property is not completed by date specified, this contract shall be deemed canceled due to an unfulfilled contingency. In such event, buyer shall deliver a notice that the sale and closing of buyer's property is not completed no later than the specified date or date specified. In the event of buyer's breach arising from buyer's failure to deliver the required notice, as we know, there's a cure involved, cure notice, seller shall exercise the option in Section 7B of the contract to accept the earnest money as seller's sole right to damages. So again, buyer's contract falls through, seller has no recourse, has to wait until the close of escrow date specified, which the close of escrow doesn't happen, and the buyer says, hey, sorry, couldn't sell my other house, here's my written notification, boom, I get my earnest money back. So it doesn't really seem fair to the seller, okay? Obviously, for obvious reasons, it doesn't. So, and essentially, you've got the 2 sections. One is the contingent on the sale and closing the buyer's property, meaning that it hasn't even gone into contract yet. The buyer's property hasn't even gone into contract. That's box 1. Box 2 is contingent on the closing of the pending sale of the buyer's property. So it's either going to be one or the other, obviously. And then it goes on to the seller has a right to review the sale documents of the buyer's sale on their property, et cetera, and gives the seller within 7 days to cancel the contract based on those documents. In other words, let's say the seller then finds out that, whoa, the buyer's doing a short sale. Well, that's not going to work. Or there's a domino effect. The buyer's contract on his property, that buyer has a contingency on theirs, you know, the domino effect. So the seller says once he sees those documents, says, oh, no, I don't want to go for this. He's got 5 days to cancel. But so that's just kind of a forewarning for you regarding the little flaw in this form. This form should be revised and out by August 1st. As you know, AAR only puts out new or revised forms twice a year, either August 1st or February 1st. In fact, I chaired this work group because since I brought the issue to AAR, they asked me to chair it. We had a 3-hour meeting on this past Tuesday, went through the whole form. We'll probably have one more meeting, and then it will go through the different AAR committees to get approved. The fix on this, just to kind of give you a heads up, is if the buyer cancels, or I'm sorry, if the buyer's contract on their house cancels, buyer notifies seller and gives evidence of that cancellation to the seller. The buyer then has, the buyer, not the seller. We looked into should the seller have the right to cancel, and we thought, let's kind of think this through. The buyer has two options at that point. They may cancel this contract, or they must waive this buyer contingency addendum and also waive any potential financing contingency that could be tied to the buyer's house not selling. Does that make sense? In other words, if you'll see in this form, let me go back because we've kind of taken some of the language and kind of moved it around. In this section right here, it says if this is also this state. It's kind of a hybrid first right of refusal. If the buyer's house that they're selling is not currently in escrow, then obviously the first box is marked. Then if the seller may obviously accept a subsequent offer, a backup offer, and they don't have to. The seller may, and the new one says may. This one says shall, but the new one says may deliver written notice to the buyer, and upon receipt of the seller's notice, the buyer basically has to, at this point, fish or cut bait. They have 5 days to either deliver to seller a written agreement to remove the contingency, or they can cancel. Okay, so it's kind of like a first right of refusal. But notice the language, to remove the contingency, this is line 18, to remove the contingency and written documentation from buyer's lender, the buyer can close escrow by the close of escrow date without the sale and closing of buyer's property, or this contract shall be deemed canceled, blah, blah, blah. So those are the two options. So we're putting that same language in if the buyer waives this buyer contingency addendum after their sale on their house falls through, then they can either cancel or they can go forward, but we'll need documentation from the buyer's lender that basically says that they can close escrow on this house and still keep their other house. They can't use that as an unfulfilled loan unfulfilled loan contingency or unfulfilled financing contingency to cancel. So that's just kind of a heads up on that form. Don't see a whole lot, especially in this market right now, with so many multiple offers. I'm not sure why a seller would want to accept a contract that was contingent upon the buyer's current house selling, but obviously that is the seller's option. But just want to let you just be aware of the flaw in the form and what the fix will be in August. So we're going to go on to the next form. Then we just have, again, the signature line. Affidavit of disclosure, I just want to go over real quickly because there seems to be not only some confusion with real estate agents, but title companies. When is an affidavit of disclosure required? This is actually the first page of the form. It says, pursuant to statute, a seller of 5 or fewer parcels of land other than subdivided land, and it is in an unincorporated area of the county, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that's when this will use. This is required. Again, this is by state law. This is the only form that statute mandates in the state of Arizona. Okay, and that they actually wrote the form itself as part of the statute. Actually, statutes. There's a few of them. So again, the litmus test is 3 things: seller of 5 or fewer parcels of land. Okay, it says land. Any parcels of land doesn't mean it's just vacant land. It can be a house. In fact, most of the time we see it as a house, not just vacant land. Okay, 5 or few, so it could be 1, because we all know what happens at 6. A seller of 6 parcels of land, now they're considered a subdivider, and now they have to have a public report. So the affidavit of disclosure is technically a mini public report in areas where they're not subdivided, because that's number 2, okay? 5 or few parcels of land other than subdivided, so if it's meets and bounds as the legal, not lot 3, such and such subdivision, or whatever the name of it is, then that's been subdivided. But if it's meets and bounds, that's 2, and that's kind of, again, your litmus test of whether it's subdivided or not. Unincorporated area of the county, that's 3. Okay, again, 5 or fewer parcels, not subdivided, unincorporated, those 3 things. So if your property that either your buyer's buying or your seller's listing has all 3 of those 3 criteria, then an affidavit of disclosure is required by state law. Now again, the AAR contract ties it into Section 4D. If the premise is located in an unincorporated area of the county, 5 or few parcels of property other than subdivided are being transferred, the seller shall deliver a completed affidavit of disclosure in the form required by law, which is again by statute, to the buyer within 5 days after the contract acceptance. Buyer shall provide notice of any disapproval within 5 days after that. Okay, so it ties it all to the 5 days, just like the insurance history, just like the SPUDs, et cetera, et cetera. So even though state law says the affidavit of disclosure, the seller can have up to, I believe it's 7 days prior to close of escrow for the buyer to receive this, and but the 5 days, then the buyer has 5 days to disapprove. So now the buyer could cancel based on statute, okay? The buyer can cancel 2 days prior to close of escrow if the seller waits till the very last minute per statute to give them the affidavit of disclosure. However, the purchase contract essentially says the seller has agreed to provide it to the buyer within those first 5 days. So if they don't within those first 5 days, then it could be a curable event by the buyer. Again, if the criteria for 1, 2, 3 apply on this particular property. So again, that's important to remember the 3 things. It's not just dirt. That's where tile companies sometimes goof up. It can be an improved land, approved property with a home on it, whatever. Could be vacant land as well. But and that's kind of the misnomer ever since this came out. I think in late 90s is when the first affidavit of disclosure came out. Then we have, then it also has to be recorded at the time the deed is recorded. Now, it is not the title company's responsibility to figure out whether a property, if the 3 things apply to a particular property. The title company is not in the business of raising their hand and saying, hey, we've investigated the property. It falls under the affidavit of disclosure. You agents better make sure that your parties complete it and sign it. That's not their job, okay? What they do as a courtesy only is once the completed affidavit of disclosure is given to the title company, they will record it on behalf of the parties at the same time they have the deed recorded. Okay? Again, it's not their obligation to make sure if it applies, but they will record it as a courtesy. So essentially it just says, who the seller is, talks about legal access, it talks about whether there's physical access, again, regarding the survey of the property, again, it talks about legal and physical access. You can see last time it was revised was in October of 2011. How the roads are maintained, if the property is in a FEMA designated regulatory floodplain, are there fissures? In fact, that's one of the last things that was added was the fissures, expansive soil, because again, by law, a seller must disclose if there are fissures or expansive soil on the property. Notice I didn't say, and again, this is by law, it doesn't say if they know of any. Okay, so the seller can't be living on a rock. Say, well, I didn't know I had a fissure on my property. Okay, again, a fissure is a great big huge crack, or expansive soil, which also causes great big huge cracks or cracks in the foundation. They can't hide behind no, I didn't know, according to statute. Okay, so that's really important to point out to your sellers on that. Same with military airport for the SPUDs. In fact, I've asked AAR to kind of do a tweak to that line in the SPUDs. The statute says seller must disclose if they are in the vicinity of a military or ancillary military airport. It doesn't say if they know. It says they will disclose it. So it's the listing agent's responsibility to help the seller through that if necessary. Not fill it out, but say, give them the maps or whatever the case is so they can establish whether or not they are in the vicinity. And the vicinity, quote unquote, is defined differently per each airport. And if you go to azre.gov, which is the Department of Real Estate's website, they actually have those maps and the definition of, quote, vicinity of those particular airports. So again, we have whether there's water, sewer, electric, natural, gas, single-party telephone. That's interesting. I guess there might be a few of those still around. I wonder if there's double-party telephones anymore. Cable TV services. Property is or is not served by water supply. So this is essentially what a public report does on just a very, very mini, limited basis. If it's served by a water company, private well, shared well, does or does not have on-site wastewater treatment facility, septic, or alternative facility or system, has or is not subject to a perk test. I know it does sound like it is vacant land, but it is not. Again, this can be an improved property as well. And whether or not it does or does not meet the applicable county and zoning, the seller signs it. It is then notarized and is also signed by the buyer. Okay, so that's pretty much it. I just wanted to go over these three forms quickly. Obviously, these aren't the types of forms necessarily that we needed to go through line by line, even though we kind of did on the lead-based paint. So I'm going to open it up to questions right now, and we're going to unmute all your lines. And so if you have any questions
The
about
leader
any
has
of these,
unmuted your line.
if you have any questions at all on any of these forms.
Hey, Martha, Ron in Sun City.
Hi, Ron.
How you doing?
I'm fine, thanks. How are you?
Good. Who do we have to contact for those pamphlets?
Your OA. And your OA knows that if they don't have any, then they contact Stephanie in my office.
Yeah, we're at the questions part. So,
Thank you.
Sure. Who else has a question?
Martha, this is Marty Mogalian. I have a question.
Hi, Marty.
Hi there. With regards to the contingency addendum, if I am representing the seller, and obviously in this marketplace, I don't think I'd be too excited about wanting to consider such an offer anyway, but
Right.
that aside, can an addendum be prepared by on behalf of the seller to basically negate or supersede some of the verbiage to kind of almost be close to what the new form coming out in August would reflect to protect the seller? Can that be, in other words, can we alter this in the form of an addendum?
Yeah, we could.
I mean, and once again, I wouldn't necessarily suggest it, nor what I think in this market, I wouldn't really have a strong consideration of that type of an offer as far as on behalf of the seller. But I'm just curious: if somebody wanted to do that, can that verbiage be prepared in an addendum and basically say this will take the place of line such and such, or in lieu of,
Sure.
or whatever, with regards to
Sure.
the contingency addendum?
So it'd be an addendum to the addendum, essentially.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Anything can be adapted to meet what the parties want to do, and that is something. And I have a feeling I know what your next question is going to be. So you and I can talk offline. Well, let me just. My guess is, hey Martha, can you come up with some language that if we represent the sellers, that would protect the sellers from the flaw in this form. My answer to that would be, by the time I write the language and we let's say get it up on zip forms, we're going to be in the middle of the summer anyway, because it takes at least 45 days to get anything.
Yeah, and I'm not in that position right now with any of my, as far as my listings are concerned, as far as my sellers. But I was just thinking going forward, if something should occur. So
Yeah,
good.
if for all of you that are listening, if you do have that situation, and again, you probably won't see it if at all because of the market the way it is right now. But if you do and you want that language, let me know and we'll work on some language.
Okay, thank you, Martha.
Thank you, Marty.
Mm-hmm.
Lead-based paint.
Yes. What about it?
And you get change the words up on top, put sales/rentals.
There's a separate. That's a good question, Ron. There's an actual separate form, AAR form for rentals.
I forgot about it. That's what I use.
So is that what you've been doing, Ron, is crossing the sales out and putting rentals?
No, I'm using rentals. I've just been a long day.
Oh, okay. So because obviously you won't have sellers, you'd have landlords, and you wouldn't have buyers, you'd have tenants. So, but I appreciate you bringing that up because there is the exact same AAR form, but it is for rentals instead of sales. And the pamphlet's required as well. Yes.
Hi, Martha. Jim Callery.
Hi, Jim.
So, hi. Back to that. I can't imagine there's a time that we would use it when we're not in a counteroffer state.
I asked something. I emailed her.
And in that event, so if we're making a counteroffer at that time, maybe we can use that buyer contingency, but in the counteroffer also state that all parties agree that if the buyer's property falls through, then the counteroffer is terminated at the same time.
Right.
In our counteroffer.
Yeah, you could, but technically the seller, technically if the buyer is making an offer and they have an offer on their current house, the buyer contingency addendum should be part of that offer because the seller doesn't know that the buyer has the other house to sell, et cetera. And another good point to bring up here as well, both the pre-qual and the LSU do have a place that is marked if the buyer, in order to qualify, the buyer has another house they have to sell. That's one of the boxes that need to be marked on both of those forms. So, let's say the buyer didn't use this buyer contingency addendum. Here comes the pre-qual or the LSU, and it says, oh, it's marked, the buyer has another house. That's a huge red flag to the seller and the listing agent that, hey, you better go back and do, at the very least, do the buyer contingency.
It's Paige in Scottsdale. Hi.
Hi, Paige.
Hi. So if we have the buyer and then the seller accepts a contingent offer and then that buyer's home does fall through, can you just recap how we advise our buyer, what our buyer should do at that point?
We represent the buyer, correct?
Right.
Okay. And our buyer's contract on their current house falls through.
Yes.
Then we need, or our buyer, excuse me, our buyer must notify the seller in writing that their sale has canceled.
Thank you. And then they cancel due to an unfulfilled contingency?
Correct.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And they get their earnest money back.
Yes.
Anybody else have any questions? Please remember you're all unmuted, so if you're talking amongst yourselves, we can hear you. So if you want to mute yourself just individually, that is *6. If you want to have a side conversation, that's fine. *6. Anybody else have any other questions? Okay, then I guess that will end our webinar for today. Let me look at my May calendar real quick. It looks like I try to do these webinars on the third Thursday of every month, which tentatively puts it at May 17th. Oh, I'm sorry, May 16th. So look for more information on that, and I appreciate you all attending. If you have any questions, comments, suggestions on any forms that we should do, please don't hesitate to send me an email. I appreciate that. So you all have a good rest of your week, and I'm here and available if you ever need me. So thanks again. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.